Good. Okay, welcome back, guys. Thanks for your patience. We were trying some new software, and it's a steep learning curve. Well, steep implies you learn very quickly. We're actually learning at a moderate rate.
It's a pain in the ass, in other words.
It's a pain. Those of you who have done any live streaming will sympathize. Those of you who aren't are like, why isn't this like a professional TV studio?
Within a month or two, you'll be happy that we are going through this growing pains, because in a month or two, we'll be on a new level of high quality.
So you're throwing yourselves on the hand grenade of technical inexperience, but we'll level up quickly. Yeah. Okay, so we were talking about.
We were making a really good point.
It was such a good point.
I remember it. If you want me to,
let's recreate it.
We were talking about status. And I was making the argument that I've been making for some time now, which is that academics get paid in status, essentially, because they do take a pay cut relative to what they could command in the open market. But that actually, over the past several years, decades perhaps, the status income that academics enjoy is actually decreasing. And it's more significant than you might think, because, as Jeffrey alluded to before, you might want to enter into academia because you imagine when you get that PhD and then you get that tenure track job, and then when you get that tenure, especially, you're just going to walk around the neighborhood and people are going to tip their hat to you. They're going to say, wow, thank you for being so smart and dedicating your life to knowledge. We admire you. You feel like you're going to enjoy this like warm glow of being a professor, because there's such a aura historically around that. But for many reasons, some that are in fact the fault of academics and some that are structural and not the fault of academics, that status enjoyment, that status premium, if you will, that you get paid in, is rapidly decreasing. And what that means is you have to think about, why are you taking a pay cut relative to what you could command in the open market if the compensating benefit that was always historically there is actually decreasing over time?
Yeah. This is a key point that economist Robert Frank at Cornell made in his first amazing book, Choosing the Right Pond. I think it was 1985. And he pointed out that, a job is a package of benefits, only some of which are financial. So some of them are the literal job title that you have. Some of them are the reputation of the industry that you work in. And if you give someone a promotion in terms of job title with no accompanying increase in income, people are often quite happy about that. And in fact, they'll take a bit of a pay cut often if they have a more impressive sounding job title. So that's been the way that academia has been able to underpay academics for generations relative to what we could have made on the open market. Every single successful tenured professor I know could have been a successful doctor or lawyer or, middle to upper level manager in a corporation, and they would have made at least 2 to 3 times as much. So there's a kind of stereotype that, academics never could have made it in any other industry. That I think is totally inaccurate. People in like lower ranking community colleges, maybe that's true, but in so-called R1 research universities, where a lot of the income of the university is from federal grants, you have to be on the ball. You have to be smart. You have to be organized. And the people who can succeed in academia often could have done lots of other stuff. So our status is decreasing for several reasons. Number one, a higher percentage of the population goes to college. There's less mystique about college and what it really is. A higher proportion of the population get PhDs, even if they don't end up working in academia. And there's this political problem that the whole rationale for university education now is being seen by a lot of the country as it's just propaganda and I don't trust them. So whereas it used to be, you had this warm glow effect of friends and neighbors going, cool, professor, versus boo, hiss, lawyer. That boo, hiss effect now is starting to shade over into academia.
And it does affect your life, especially another variable here that's important is your own kind of family social status background. I've also noticed in my experience in academia that I think this really matters for how you experience academia and whether or not it's worth it for you. So in my case, neither of my parents even went to university, and I was the first person essentially to go to university, let alone get a PhD, let alone become a professor. And one of the most jarring things about that is you might think, because of that, when I would go home to see my family, or even, it's not even about my family, we're talking about normal people here, basically just normal people at all outside of academia. You might think that when I go home to see my family or tell normal people, from my childhood or whatever, that I'm a professor and tell them about my life, you might think that their appreciation and admiration would be all the greater, right? I think it's actually the opposite. I think, in my case, the psychological benefits to being a professor were actually lower than they were for a lot of my colleagues whose parents were professors or whose parents were other, had other occupations in the liberal professions, because those people respect it. Those people understand it. And, that's a kind of inside baseball. For me, it was really interesting. Like I would have some of the biggest milestones in my career, like publishing, an article in a really prestigious journal. And there was pretty much nobody in my life who cared. And not because they were cruel or inconsiderate. Like, no, my parents are loving, caring people, but because nobody knows anything about academia and nobody really cares. And it's one of the kind of backdoor effects of this kind of generalized social lack of respect or loss of respect for academia, that it's just, no one's really impressed. No one's really happy for you. And that is a real bummer. It really adds up. However, think about it this way. Like once I quit academia, one of the first things I started to do was to focus on a book that I had been wanting to write for a long time, as a personal project. And I started writing that, and I don't have a publisher for it. I don't anything. I'm actually accepting pre-orders for it right now, just on the internet. I've basically gone all in, just radically on the internet. And now my parents actually see my internet stuff and they think it's cool. It's very interesting. I'm not saying you should organize your life around impressing your parents, but there is something real going on here, in which I would argue that what's actually happening is that the status benefits of being successful on the internet are increasing at the same time that the status benefits of being an academic are decreasing. You know what all the high school kids want to be, what all the teenagers want to be? They want to be YouTube stars.
That was an amazing stat from that poll.
Yeah.
The Chinese kids and high school students all want to be astronauts, and the American high school students all want to be YouTubers.
Right.
Yeah.
So in a weird way, like to a kind of well-bred, highly educated person from a high status family, if that describes you in the audience right now, you might think obviously being a professor is more successful than being an independent weirdo on the internet, making money on the internet. But I would actually argue that viewpoint is increasingly obscure and rare. And for most people in the developed countries, increasingly being successful on the internet has that kind of rock star kind of impressive, admirable mystique that once upon a time academics might have enjoyed, but no longer. So I think that's a really important variable that's kind of going on in the background of our culture right now in ways that I think it's going to make more waves than people realize in the not too distant future. I think it already is.
Yeah. So when I teach my human sexuality class, I point out to my students that, what most people want out of life really, in terms of their career choices, is a pretty high chance of success at making enough money that you can find a mate and have kids and have a house and kind of support a reasonably comfortable lifestyle. That you don't want to wait too long to get to that point, right? You ideally like to be able to do that in your mid to late 20s rather than your mid to late 40s. You'd like a reasonable degree of social status from friends and family and potential mates and public at large. And you'd like to feel good about yourself, ethically and intellectually and socially, and like you're thriving and flourishing and meeting interesting new challenges. So with that frame, our kind of discussion is going to be, what's the likelihood that academia can deliver that to you versus a kind of social media route? And I think the crucial thing to understand about academia is your chance, even if you're smart and hardworking, your chance of becoming a tenured professor at any point is low. It's like under 10%, between starting grad school versus getting tenured at a decent university. it's not going to go bankrupt. It's probably under 10%.
And that's assuming you have the ability.
And that's right. And that's assuming you have those individual differences traits that we talked about to succeed at all.
When you factor in the possibility that you're overestimating your own ability, that 10% gets even smaller.
Now, by contrast, what's the chance that you'd actually make enough money through social media channels?
That's a good question.
To support that. Maybe that's something we should talk about for a few minutes, because we're just struggling to figure that out, and where are we actually going to get our income streams?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think you can make a good case that still at this point in time, your chances of carving out a very successful kind of internet entrepreneurial model of somehow conducting a life of the mind that's a long shot also. I think you have to bite that bullet for sure. But what I do know is that there are a lot of people doing it, not necessarily in a kind of impressive, highbrow, kind of legitimate intellectual way. That really, as far as I'm concerned, I don't really know of anyone who's cracked that nut yet. I kind of see that as my kind of goal that's like essentially what I'm trying to figure out. And I kind of see myself as on the very frontier of how to do that. And even I'm pretty successful so far. I'm definitely on a successful trajectory. I've almost replaced my income as an academic, to be honest. If you allow for freelance stuff that I'm doing on the side, then if you allow for freelance stuff like non-research stuff, then I've already replaced my income as an academic, and then some actually already. And I'm only a few months out, of quitting academia. But if you look at even just what I've been able to make for myself in terms of Patreon and then assorted independent other income streams on the internet, I'm already at about 50%, a little bit more than 50% of what I was making as an academic in my 6th year as a permanent academic. So not bad. Now, if you look at the larger if you survey the landscape of all the different types of people making money out there on the internet, I think I don't have the data to back this up, although, if you're an enterprising researcher, you should go and get this data and figure this out. I think you make a good case that the chances of carving out a minimally viable, decent, respectable income through creative, independent efforts on the internet, I think you make a good case that the chances are higher than they are for academia, simply because think about how many people you can cite off the top of your head who are making decent money on the internet. Well, you might not be as plugged into the internet as I am, so maybe, well, if you're watching YouTube, then you probably can cite off the top of your head more people who are making a decent income by doing some independent intellectual thing, probably a podcast, maybe a YouTuber that you like. You can probably think of more people like that than you can think of people who firsthand who became professors as a career. So, that's not a clean test of the hypothesis, but I think that's how the data looks to me. And the final thing I would say on that is you have to account for the way the wind is blowing. That's kind of a point you were making before about looking into the future. It's not really about what the situation is now. You have to make educated guesses about what the culture and the political economy is going to be in 5 years, in 10 years, in 25 years. And I mean, I can't tell you what to do, but I can give you my honest testimony that for me, and I'm younger than Jeffrey, so I have a different calculus. I think for someone in Jeffrey's stature and at his stage in his career, I think academia makes perfect sense. But for someone like me who's young, I'm only 32, and I still have a lot of, piss and vinegar in me. I have my best years ahead of me, I like to think. Not to say that you don't.
I've got plenty of piss and vinegar also.
Not to say that you don't. But I really do. And I guess more years, objectively, probably, if I'm lucky. My point being just that for someone like me, my honest testimony was academia just felt like a sinking ship, basically. Like I was on the Titanic and I'm watching podcasters make increasingly large sums of money. I'm watching all these different people doing incredibly interesting, creative things and carving out not only decent lifestyles, incomes for themselves, but in many cases better than what I was making as an academic. I'm watching all this happen around me, and I'm just like, I'm jumping off the ship, man, and I'm going to try my luck on the wild, wild west.
So there's like the people building their own lifeboats, but then some of the people are building like yachts that are even better than the Titanic.
Right, and so it's like at the very least, I'm confident I can build a lifeboat, but maybe, just maybe, I'll get to build that yacht also, and that's actually a crucial point. Is that it's risky, but the upside is unlimited, whereas the upside in academia is pretty limited. You're a truck. So go on.
Yeah. So just to make this concrete, I would say, if you think about the total income I've made in my whole life over my whole career, probably about 60% of it has been my academic salary over the years since, I graduated PhD in 1994. Probably 10% has been consulting work with industry and paid speaking gigs. And then probably 30% of it has been book deals, book advances from mainstream publishers for the 4 or 5 books that I've done. So one way to think about the social media career track is, and this is how a lot of mainstream publishers or authors think about it, is the social media platform is just the way that you build your credibility as an author in a highly competitive publishing landscape. And in fact, that's kind of the way I got into this. Is I thought, okay, I'm going to do another book after my mate book that I did 4 years ago. Now in this publishing landscape, to get a decent book deal with a decent 6-figure advance from a mainstream publisher in New York, you need to have a certain number of Twitter followers. You need to have your YouTube channel. You need to be savvy about how all of this stuff works, because mainstream publishers no longer do the kind of marketing and publicity that they used to do 20 years ago for new books. So authors have to be very entrepreneurial about outreach. But you can take that mindset and you can kind of flip it, and you can kind of go, oh no, the goal of social media is not just to increase my sort of trendiness in terms of how New York publishers view me. It's actually a potentially replacement for that process. Maybe you don't need the book advance. Maybe you just self-publish, or you have other income streams. Now, to me, that is honestly a little bit of a scary proposition, because book advances are awesome. They are in a contract. You know that you will get them. If you write the book, you will get the tranches of the advance that are promised. Nothing's guaranteed in social media. But I think a lot of the star professors that you've heard about, Jordan Peterson, Steven Pinker, etc., are making the majority of their income from mainstream book publishing, speaking tours, right, that are paid, paid talks at corporate events, and their actual university salary is probably well under 30 or 40% of their income.
Mm-hmm.
And their teaching duties and actual research duties are also under 30 or 40% of their time budget. So there is this big overlap that's happening between being a successful professor, being a successful author with a mainstream publishing company, and then third, doing social media stuff. So, you have to think about that. And the second point I would make about this is, as young people get increasingly skeptical about the value of a university credential and about going into student debt and all of that, like the amount of political attention that the student loan crisis is getting is colossal. And that is going to affect how high school, students view college. I think the demand for college will go down, at least the demand for traditional colleges. That means tuition revenue will go down. That means the number of jobs in academia will go down. It means the salaries will go down. So conversely, though, all the young people who decide, hey, I don't want to spend $150,000 on a college degree, but who still want to learn stuff, might be willing to spend maybe up to 10 or 20% of that amount through other ways of learning things, like social media. So you might see increased revenue in these alternative media channels.
Yeah. I think there are also other reasons to expect that. For instance, our basic infrastructure for payments is only half developed. I mean, it's still relatively clunky for me to give you a little bit of money for a blog post that I like or whatever. This is increasingly smooth. It's increasingly becoming a part of our culture to give money for things that we like, but it's only just begun. And it's not even half of what they have in China, for instance. So if you use China as a yardstick of what the internet in the West is probably eventually going to look a little bit more like, if you accept that as the trajectory, then one thing we're likely to see is an increasing sophistication and low transaction costs when it comes to micropayments, for instance, that being increasingly embedded in our apps. And as that happens, that just means there's going to be more money available, essentially, for creating things and selling them in one way or another on the internet. I think we're only at the beginning of this, and all of the technological trends seem to be pointing in the direction of increasing the pool of money that will be slushing around for, high quality, interesting, valuable, independently created intellectual content. I think there's a huge demand for it. I mean, look at someone like Jordan Peterson. What's so interesting about him as a phenomenon is that he was just, toiling in obscurity, posting his lectures to YouTube over the years. Little did anyone know over this time he's building a really loyal, passionate audience. Before he became really famous, he's doing this for years, right? No one knew that people out there, normal people out there, who academics often think are stupid and kind of, they assume everyone outside of the academy is kind of, lazy bumpkins or whatever. No, actually, a lot of those people are quite smart. Maybe they're not as smart as academics, but they're quite smart, and they can't find enough high value intellectual content to sink their teeth into, which they really want to sink their teeth into. And someone like Jordan Peterson is just, I think, an opening salvo in precisely this this process, a kind of early indication of how much demand there is from the public for authentic, disintermediated intellectual content. And yeah, so I think there's a huge gap in the market there. And yeah, that's where I'm putting my money, obviously.
Yeah. So the tricky thing right now is the way you monetize sort of social media outreach is basically either through advertising revenue. So you become someone who delivers content, but the actual money is being made through ads, or through a kind of Patreon model of like, please just donate money to me. It's kind of hard to charge for content, and people are still resistant to paying for content. You know why? Because they're not doing a direct comparison between cost per hour of attending a university lecture, pro rata in terms of tuition you're paying, versus cost per hour of watching an awesome YouTube, like hopefully this or Jordan Peterson or whatever. When I tell my students, look, remember, don't be late to class, because you are effectively paying $30 to $70 per hour tuition, depending on if it's in-state or out-of-state tuition. It blows their minds. They never thought about it in terms of, oh my God, this is like 8 times the cost of seeing Avengers Endgame, just attending some random lecture. And so there's a pain point where people aren't quite willing to pay for content that's delivered in non-traditional channels, but they're too willing to pay for content delivered in a university lecture hall.
Right, for sure. But I would add to that I think actually people are more willing to pay for that independent content than most people assume.
Yeah.
Certainly more than the average academic assumes. I mean, before I made my grand break from academia, I shared my plans and my visions with a lot of my colleagues, over drinks or whatever, in my more candid moments. And generally, I was lucky to have mostly, supportive colleagues and friends. But, there was always a bit of like, surely that's not feasible, right? Like, they supported me, but they're kind of like, there's just not enough money out there for that. There's no way, right? Was kind of the implicit skepticism. And so I was braced for it to be more difficult, honestly. Like every step of the way, put it this way, I have been positively surprised by how much people are happy to throw money at you if you're doing high quality stuff that they really like. I've been surprised. My expectations have been exceeded each step along the way. So I think it's actually more than people think. The hard part, of course, is finding that, what in Silicon Valley they call product market fit, right? I mean, that's the hard part. It's finding your people and finding the types of products and services or whatever combination of the two that they're most interested in from you. That's the really tricky part. But the money is there, I think. And I think there's also a major first mover's advantage, which is another reason why I kind of was a bit radical in going all in and not doing a kind of graduated approach and just kind of putting all my chips in. Because I think that if you get in now, as things like mobile payments become increasingly spread, as patronage culture becomes increasingly widespread, I think, there's just a lot of benefits to getting in early.
Yeah. And bear in mind, the whole economic model of academia has changed dramatically over the last 2 centuries. So back when Charles Darwin tried to go to med school at University of Edinburgh, and it didn't work very well. This is the 1830s. Most of the income of university lecturers was actually from tips, right? The students would attend a lecture, and depending on the quality of the
I didn't know
lecture,
that.
they would give tips. They were paid almost nothing. It was very
Oh,
entrepreneurial.
interesting.
And then throughout the Victorian era, people like Thomas Henry Huxley, who couldn't get an academic position because they were from the wrong social class, would do public lecture tours, and they would go talk to working men's clubs and museums and all of that. And they would basically have the same career model as a sort of Jordan Peterson,
right,
or Joe Rogan. So
Emerson is another example.
Yeah. And I think that the problem with that is you have to be quite good at doing everything and all the personal branding. I think what's going to happen actually with social media is there will be sort of umbrella brands that are doing both quality control and vetting people and deciding who's going to join our little school or camp or streaming service. And they're going to help researchers with all this technical stuff that's really hard, right? So I can imagine a sort of national brand of interesting intellectual YouTubers where it's like, if you join our channel or whatever, we will literally send you a kit full of all this lighting and cameras and shit that you need. Not necessarily such awesome backgrounds, but we'll send you all that. We will have a little book that explains exactly what to do. These are our quality standards. Here's how to build the audience. Here's how to do mutual interviews with the other people under our umbrella. And that will make it much easier for the ordinary viewer to kind of have confidence that this is going to be quality content, that the people involved have been checked out, that they have reliable equipment, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think people would be more willing to pay for that kind of service than a sort of confusing anarchic system of every person trying to build like the Jeffrey Miller brand or the Justin Murphy brand.
That's an interesting speculation. Yeah. And you make a good case for it. I think you could see it going other ways, because it definitely seems to be that the drift at the moment is toward increasing informality, increasing decentralization, increasing fragmentation. And I think the major force pulling it in that direction, kind of against what you're saying, is that a lot of it is segmentation by taste, essentially by arbitrary kind of, personality factors or, tastes essentially. And so it's not so much vetting for quality or vetting for, who you can have confidence in, so
it's
much
just
as
to match with the audience.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's this like radical fragmentation taking place where people aren't so much concerned about like, can I trust this? Right. But they're more concerned about, do I like this? And so, yeah, but you could imagine maybe at the end of this process of fragmentation, and once every possible micro niche of intellectual and artistic tastes have been kind of populated, you can imagine that from that chaos, there would be a demand for trust, validation, and you can imagine those dynamics to possibly take place after or something like that. But yeah, I think right now, actually, the way to succeed in going independent or going on the internet is to not think so much about trust or being valid or validating yourself, but freeing or liberating yourself to be the most of whatever you are, to find all those people out in the world who are just like you in that tiny micro niche, essentially. And it's very confusing. It's very counterintuitive. This is like not how people think. We kind of all came up in a kind of mass media model where to succeed in anything that has to do with media, you want to get the most eyeballs possible, right? You want to create a product that the most people can trust, that the most people like, and that's how you win. We're actually in this weird state now where to win, you have to do the opposite. You have to actually be courageous enough to be your weird, kind of obscure, somewhat untrustworthy, somewhat dubious, somewhat sketchy and weird and strange self, but in a way that resonates emotionally, I think, and aesthetically and socially. And the people say, oh, I have no idea if this guy is like legit or not. He could be totally, espousing bullshit, but he's my kind of guy. And he's funny in the way that I like, and he's cool in the way that I like, and he represents what I want to be. And yeah, so I think that's kind of the game at the moment.
Yeah. So the personal branding, I think, is still going to be very important, but people misunderstand how it works. Like, I think we grew up with a sort of model of the kind of people who appear on national mainstream media are all groomed to be a certain way. They have a certain personality. They're like moderately intelligent, highly extroverted. They don't use big words. They take themselves fairly seriously, blah, blah, blah. Social media, I think the win for most people is you take who you are and you crank it up to 11, whatever direction that is.
Right.
So if you're an introverted Aspie like me, you just kind of have to own it and you be that authentically, or even like amp it up a bit. And that's what works.
Right.
And that's YouTube culture.
And if you're consistent and you put in the work over time, then even if there's only 1,000 other people in the world who are like you, if you work hard enough and long enough, you're going to get out to those people, right? You only need to get that tiny micro niche that is like you. And there's millions of those micro niches. There's probably literally millions of micro niches that can support a small number of independent creators. And so when you think about that, it's a very different model of the game that's being played.
And bear in mind, some of those micro niches are billionaires, right? Some of those micro niches are people who are in certain industries who have certain interests, and they're curious, open-minded people. They still want to learn stuff throughout their lives, and they're perhaps willing to be patrons to do that. So this all goes back not just to a sort of Darwinian era, giving tips to your university lecturer, but all the way back to a Renaissance patronage model, where the rich, high status people in society get some of their status from distributing money to others doing intellectual work that they think is valuable. Now, of course, at the moment, the one high status patron for the last 50 years has been the federal government. But that will not necessarily continue.
Right.
So, academics are so used to sort of begging for money from the government. That is the entire game of getting academic grants, that they're not very well geared to like begging for money from rich people or consortia of people or companies, whatever. But I think that's one kind of retooling that's going to have to happen. And the nice thing about a sort of, rich people patronizing research model is rich people have quite diverse tastes politically, ideologically, intellectually, compared to the one dominant force, federal government. The federal government has extremely narrow and dominant views of what is worth funding. So I think a patronage model could kind of break that down and create more niches for a much wider array of thinkers and writers and YouTubers.
Definitely. Something you said before that I liked, or what it made me think of, was when you were describing the umbrella brand, where you can imagine umbrella brands emerging. What that sounds like to me is basically a label, like a record label, but for social media. And you are starting to see this. So like some of you on YouTube might know these people like Jake Paul and his brother Logan Paul. They're like very, very big YouTubers. But they recently they've built a label, and you see more and more of the big YouTubers. They essentially build labels like the record labels, right? So the logic is very similar, and it's very similar to what you're saying. Not exactly, but kind of similar. And in some way, I mean, you and I are kind of now experimenting with. I mean, we're in early days. We don't know what will come of it, but it's a somewhat similar kind of logic that we were just like, hey, we know we want to keep doing this kind of stuff. We want to experiment on this more. Let's pool efforts. Let's learn from each other and collaborate. And although we don't know exactly where it's going, you could easily imagine one pathway is that if we are successful, if we work hard and kind of grow out these platforms or whatever, we could then like kind of sponsor other people essentially, or bring them in and build out that way. So I think that is a viable possible expectation of how this plays out, you see more and more of that kind of stuff, I think, possible.
Yeah. So you see this shift whenever you get the mindset changing from, oh, we're all competing against each other and life is a zero-sum game, and if you have more subscribers than me, then I'm losing and you're winning, to there are YouTube subcultures that are quite mutually supportive, right? Where people actually, encourage subscribing to my other people working in the same space.
Definitely.
Whether it's like the tech reviews or the unboxing or ASMR videos or whatever. And I think the kind of intellectuals, thinkers, authors, ex-academics who go into social media are increasingly kind of recognizing the value of doing that, where, your gain can be my gain if we interview each other and we kind of share our fan bases. And this is what always happens in every mature industry, is you get these umbrella brands. It could be a movie studio, that kind of has a certain set of directors and actors they tend to work with. Could be a record label, could be a publishing house, right, where the credibility of the publishing house helps launch new authors and provides continuity for older authors. You're going to see a lot more of that. And bear in mind, a university itself, in a way, is just one of these umbrella brands that happens to have a physical infrastructure called a campus and a certain set of support staff and administrators. But really, it's a set of research entrepreneurs running their little lab groups, trying to get their grants. And it's the same dynamics, I think, are gonna carry over into social media.
Yeah, for sure. I would also add that people have only just begun even starting to experiment with the different forms that are possible and what types of intellectual projects or goods or services or whatever you want to call them are feasible economically. We don't know. We need more experimentation. Like we honestly don't know yet. For instance, I'm basically, since I've gone all in on this kind of wager, I'm basically just trying 100 different things and seeing what sticks. And again, I was braced more realistically for more things to fail. Like I was expecting more to fail than actually what's happened. Like I do a monthly seminar, for instance. I saw Adam in the chat, for instance. What's up, Adam? Adam is a participant in my seminar. I think he mentioned it earlier on. And it was just a kind of experiment that I concocted. All I do, I don't even know if I've told you much about it, but all it is I carve out 2 hours a month for anyone who wants what is essentially a kind of grad school seminar experience. So for those of you who don't know, in grad school, seminars are mostly student-led. There's not like a lecture necessarily. The professor basically kind of supervises and kind of facilitates the students, gives them readings, encourages them or challenges them or requires them to discuss the readings, perhaps give presentations. But it's most of the content of the seminar is organized around readings, and it's student-produced content, whatever that content might be. The professor kind of mostly sits back and facilitates and gives feedback. And so for your average grad school seminar, the institution is providing extremely little. It's a classic kind of example of something that's currently requires all of this overhead in the institutional university, but that as someone with a PhD who's led, graduate seminars, and I've supervised PhD students to completion and all that, I can easily give that 2 hours of time, the absolute full experience, everything you would get from a grad school seminar. I can give that to people on my own volition for none of the overhead that is required for the university to do it. So what I do is basically I just concocted this experiment. I said, if someone would like to just, obviously I can't give you a degree, I can't give you the credentials, which is obviously a large part of why people want grad school. So being frank about not offering any of that, I'm even being frank that I'm not necessarily going to teach you anything, but I'm going to give you a grad school seminar experience. I'm going to facilitate that for you and help you run your own projects. Pay me $25 a month and you'll get essentially what you would get out of a grad school seminar. And lo and behold, I think now I have 15 people who are paying me every month $25 a pop for 1 2-hour seminar session, essentially, just like a grad school. And so it's like, that is not by itself enough to live on, but it's more than I thought I would have. I thought maybe a few people would like it, would be into it. I didn't know what to expect. So it's just one example of, I don't know of anyone who's even tried that yet. As far as I know, I'm the first professor who has tried to do that, and it exceeded my expectations. So who knows what else just hasn't even been tried yet.
So that'll be like a half to a quarter the cost of a typical university seminar in terms of tuition that students are paying. And the thing about a seminar, of course, is,
well, no, it's like 1%.
Right.
So it's like 1% of what they pay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually did the math once.
Right. Per contact. Yeah.
Depending on how you break it down. Yeah.
So and of course, the quality of the seminar depends hugely on the quality of the other students in it. And so, Ben, who took a couple of my at least one of my seminar classes, will know some people contribute a lot, and it's great, and they're smart, and they do the readings. Other people are kind of dead wood. Other people are actively disruptive. But imagine a situation where you have some little pet interest that is socially taboo.
Mm-hmm.
And you would like to meet other people who share the same interest and actually have a discussion about it. And there's not enough people in your hometown to do that, but globally, there's probably enough people. So if you can find like the one thinker or writer who's willing to host that kind of discussion, it's a great focal point, to use a game theory term, to kind of congregate around that person, and then to be able to have a meetup. And as long as the kind of leader is reasonably good at screening people and kind of keeping the discussion on track, mm-hmm. you might actually be able to have a really cool intellectual life that centers around issues that you're passionate about and that you could never talk about at a university.
Right.
Where they would never even offer the seminar on that topic.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's basically already one example of something that, not to brag or anything, but that I do feel like I'm essentially pioneering. But the reason I mention it really is because the big question is, what other things are there that we haven't even really tried? Like for instance, you and I, we haven't even started talking yet about actually just doing courses online. I mean, that's already a huge industry. That's not new. But there aren't that many really legit academics and intellectuals with, independent research careers behind them doing courses. A lot of the like online course market is, people of dubious repute selling, courses of dubious repute, so academics have hardly even begun to really kind of enter that market. So I think the sky's the limit, really. It's only just begun.
Of course, at this point, most of the online courses you can get are either university branded, and then they're subject to all the same censorship and the same Overton window that limits what you're allowed to talk about, as the universities would impose upon live in-person lectures, mm-hmm. right? Or it's some flaky person like selling their pet theory of personal development, or their mm-hmm. Nutritional supplements, or whatever they're doing. But I think there's a big middle ground where you could have intellectually serious courses that have none of the same censorship constraints that current American universities are subject to. One further thing I wanted to say about the economics of all this, of course, is there's no reason to limit your vision to America if you're American, or to Britain if you're British. English is increasingly a real lingua franca, the common denominator of global communication. There's a lot of people in India who already speak English, a lot of people in China learning it. So if you do something cool with social media somehow, and you can monetize it somehow, your market is not limited to America, 330 million people. It's also European Union, another 300 million people. India and China, 1.3 billion each. And even other places, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, anywhere that you can kind of get around the great internet firewalls. And I suspect at some point, even in China, there will be a little bit more liberal access to American social media content. So you're looking at a global market, and you don't have to reach hundreds of millions of people. If you only reach 50 centimillionaires
Yeah.
who are really interested in what you have to say, right? Or you can reach 100,000 retired engineers who are really interested in what you have to say.
Do you know Kevin Kelly's famous essay, 1,000 True Fans? Yeah, so he kind of did some back of the napkin calculations, and what he argues is that what you need really is just 1,000 true fans, where he defines true fans as people who will buy, who just basically love what you do and will buy anything you put out. If you can get to 1,000 of that, you can have a comfortable, successful, financially happy lifestyle as an independent content creator, essentially. So a lot of people cite that, that's not like extremely sophisticated quantitative analysis or anything, but I think that's a useful heuristic.
Yeah. So if you have 1,000 true fans and each of them give 1,000th of their income to you because you provide some form of awesomeness to them, then you're going to make about as much money as the average of your fans.
Yeah.
So if your fans are really rich, quite a bit richer than you don't even need that many. Even if your fans are poor, like they're just middle-class folks in India, you might still be able to make a decent living. It's just people have to overcome this block against paying for real content. And universities managed to convince them to do that, 50 years ago with the mass college education movement. I think the next 20 years is going to be a sea change in how that works. So should we turn to some of the questions? And if you're watching from Europe and it's midnight or 11 p.m. there, thank you. Appreciate it.
I actually saw one which I could take right away.
Sure.
Adam Green, who is the person I cited before, who's in my seminar. Adam is asking, he asked a few questions in the past couple minutes, asking more or less to the effect of, okay, Justin, that sounds really cool for you, but you not only did you get a PhD, and that'll kind of enabled you to now do what you're doing, but you have skills that are very kind of practical and marketable. I think he mentioned before, because I do data analysis and I'm quite proficient in that, and some computer programming of statistical analysis and stuff like that. So those are true facts, and they do enable me and empower me to kind of make these calculated risks on the wild west that I am making. So that's a welcome point. That is true. But the question, I think, at the bottom of it, which Adam asks, is, can you still do what I'm doing without either those credentials or highly kind of marketable, valuable skills that command money on the open market? And I think the answer is that yes, you can, and we know you can because there are people who are doing it. But it is going to be harder, no doubt. I mean, I have to kind of bite that bullet that I definitely do have some, I guess, privileges, you could call them, that enable what I'm doing right now. What I would add to that, though, is this is one reason why when people, because I get a fair amount of emails, like I'm sure Jeffrey does, asking things like, should I go to grad school? Here's what I'm interested in. Here's what I want to do. I don't know if I should go to grad school. Should I carve out some kind of radical independent thing on the internet like you? I get emails like that. And usually, it's different for different types of people depending on what they say about themselves. But usually what I really urge is a kind of hybrid strategy. And I think that, so what I mean by that is, if you're able to get a PhD, if you're able to be accepted into a PhD program and have that fully paid and get a small stipend, and you're young and you don't have kids and you don't have other priorities or whatever, then hell yeah, it's go for it. There are much worse ways to kind of spend 6 years of your life. Only good things can come of it. Maybe you'll go into academia and you'll like it. Maybe most likely you won't go into academia because there aren't that many positions, but you're still going to be empowered, and options and doors are going to open up for you from having that PhD. But what I think is increasingly the smart move, honestly, is you pursue a PhD and you do it vigorously and seriously, and you work hard on it, but you consciously are also dedicating a lot of time to building up some sort of independent exit plan. I think that's increasingly the smart thing to do. And I don't think I know a lot of people who are doing that consciously. I think I see a lot of people who are falling into that organically because it makes a lot of sense. So for instance, Amy Therese, for instance, who some of you may or may not know from Twitter, she's an extremely vocal, kind of aggressive, kind of anti-woke left writer and thinker and podcaster. she's doing really well for herself in her kind of public presence. She's a PhD student who's currently a PhD student in Australia, I believe. She clearly is investing a lot of time in her public profile and platform, probably at the cost of her PhD or at the cost of her kind of academic prospects. But I think someone like her is actually a really good example of how to play it. You know, you do a PhD, it gives you time, it gives you space. Hopefully it gives you a stipend, it gives you encouragement and social pressure to read and to be sharp and to be impressive and be disciplined. It gives you confidence, which is very useful. It gives you that bit of a little bit of a status bump. And I think the winning strategy is you use those resources to do as well as you can in that. Try your luck in the lottery of an academic job, but meanwhile, that whole time from the day you get into your PhD program, you're actually giving like 40% of your effort, maybe even 50% of your free time to building the exit pod, whether that's a podcast or a blog or a startup in many cases might be. I think that's an increasingly clever move. So for someone like Adam, who's like very bright and young, looking out into the future, if you're able to work hard, you're really smart and able to work hard, I think that's a really good move. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I think it's really good to identify what are some key skills that are going to be highly marketable almost regardless of how the economy goes. The one wild card, of course, is AI and what is AI going to be able to automate. But at least for the foreseeable future, I think learning, statistics, data analysis, kind of experiment design, or how to think rationally about evidence and what it means and how to challenge it, being able to write and speak and communicate, having some audiovisual technical skills that are sufficient to sort of do social media outreach, educating yourself about social media itself and how it works. Look, if a typical grad student spent at least 10% of their PhD effort on those skills in a serious way, you'd have fallback careers and you'd be able to greatly amplify your impact, even if you stay in academia. I mean, the number of people I know, in academia who are like really good at doing live in-person lecturing, but actually kind of suck at doing public speaking to anybody other than university students or colleagues. It's amazing. And the number of them who can do very articulate in-person conversations, but it falls apart if they're on TV doing a live interview. That's very, very common. So when I was doing my postdocs in England, I took every opportunity to do things like media training courses to sort of practice, okay, explain your research in 2 minutes flat. Stopwatch starts now, go. Most academics hated that kind of training and avoided it, but I kind of loved it because I saw this is how you reach college students who are going to apply to your program to become your grad students. How else are they going to hear about you apart from either through national mainstream media or social media? So if you can't attract those quality, talented students, like you're going to end up being surprised that your lab group sucks and you won't know why. Okay, that's my rant about that.
Ben, did you catch any good questions over the time we've been live streaming?
Oh, this is a really quick thing I can answer. Devin, if you are applying to grad school, bear in mind that it's really important to choose a potential mentor who's at kind of a good career stage for you in terms of mentoring availability and effort. I personally think the perfect mentor is typically recently tenured associate professor, roughly between mid-30s and like mid to late 40s.
Yeah, they're not jaded and lazy.
They're not jaded and lazy and set in their ways, but they're not so young or pre-tenure that they're panicked about what they have to do. And ideally, they've already mentored 3 or 4 students, so they kind of know how to do that effectively. And ideally, they have enough reputation in the field that when they write you recommendation letters, somebody knows who they are. So think about that. And most students don't. They're just like, oh, this person's doing interesting research. Well, that's the research they probably did 15 years ago. Maybe they're not even doing it anymore. So think very strategically about where do you really want to apply and who do you want to work with?
Another point on the question of, do you need credentials to signal competence and to achieve these different types of other goals? Another thing to keep in mind is I think we're going to see more and more ventures on the front of validating competence independently outside of these like ancient institutions. And you're already starting to see this. You're starting to see a bunch of startups like Lambda School that are basically figuring out how to hack the credential problem. And I think there's every reason to believe that you're going to see more and more of that in other domains also. So for instance, like Adam asks, could you run a paid seminar like I am without having first gotten a PhD to signal one's competence? It's a really good question. And maybe in the moment, I guess having a PhD and having experience running grad seminars gives me a kind of unique edge in being able to offer that type of thing in a way that people find credible and attractive. But what about when there are popular and well-known websites for validating your IQ or validating how much you've read or validating what you've been able to do? And this becomes culturally acceptable and widespread and reliable, right? I mean, that stuff right now, we do very little of that relative to what could be done. That's technically, trivial to implement. That's a social blockage. But there's huge demand for being able to credibly and reliably kind of demonstrate your ability. And it seems like there's a lot of promising ventures going down this path. So again, I mean, everything is a risk, everything is calculated risk, but I would put my money on the competence and credential problems being increasingly attenuated or kind of beaten back by increasingly sophisticated startups or different types of tools that will allow us to solve that problem. Do you think much about that, Jeffrey?
Yeah, this was a big theme in my book 10 years ago, Spent, which had a lot of criticism of higher education as a runaway credential system. Mm-hmm. And my argument there was that in the future, there will be ways to do adaptive intelligence testing or to just estimate intelligence pretty accurately from the sum total of all your existing social media posts.
Right.
And where that can feed into being its own credential, where you no longer need a bachelor's degree to prove, I have an IQ of at least 105, which is basically the whole value to employers is you had the IQ to succeed, you had the conscientiousness to succeed. That's what a college degree does. Well, guess what? You can prove your intelligence and conscientiousness in hugely more efficient and even more reliable ways through various kinds of digital analysis. And I think that's the future. And as soon as that problem is cracked, the whole house of cards of university credentialing falls apart.
Right.
And there's no rational reason, to need to go somewhere for 4 years and pay $100,000 just to prove I'm pretty smart and I can work pretty hard. Because that's most of the value of the degree at this point.
Right. So again, it kind of depends on how soon do you think that's going to get cracked, or maybe you should go out and crack it.
And one of the models here, I think, is this effective altruism subculture I'm involved with, which has been extremely efficient and rational at challenging the university credentialing kind of runaway process and trying to establish social norms and ways of sharing information between people that mean that you can just be like a high school graduate. And if you're smart enough and you know a particular effective altruism topic well enough, you can get hired in an EA think tank and work on really important, intellectually challenging problems with bright colleagues, many of whom might not even have college degrees. So that, I think, could be scaled up, into other industries and other subcultures.
Yeah. What do you think? We've been going for quite some time. I don't know when you want to wrap it up.
I feel like we've had a bunch of questions we haven't really properly looked at. So why don't we just handle a few of them fairly briefly, and then should have made a scroll because I want to keep my fans happy.
Wait, go down real quick just to the last one I can give a quick answer to that. The question is there a pitfall right now of being labeled as a spokesperson for an ideology, for instance, patriarchy, when you're just trying to convey basic traditional scholarship? Yeah, huge pitfall. Not even a pitfall. It's going to happen a lot. So yeah, you just have to bite that bullet. But as long as you have thick skin, who cares? Right now, if you do anything at all interesting or independent intellectually out in the wild, oh yeah, be ready for everyone to call you every name in the book. And that is actually a little bit more crazy than people might think. It's actually, I think it's worse than people might think if you haven't kind of subjected yourself to that. But you get inoculated to it relatively quickly. And I mean, all those people calling you names, it's just noise, So if you can deal with that, it's not a big deal.
So you can think of it as in two ways. One is, oh no, I'm alienating 70% of people with my weird little view. The positive spin is I'm segmenting my market and I'm reaching people who typically don't have any access to something that fits with their ethical system or their worldview.
Right.
And there are so many of those little subcultures that are not being properly served by American intellectual culture at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. I should get sponsorship from the papacy. That would be interesting. Pontifex, reach out if you want to.
We've been watching the TV show The Young Pope, which is fascinating to us with our great Catholic eye candy.
So Adam says, how many students are enterprising and intrepid enough to defect from the academic signaling system? Well, it's a good question, but you know what? To succeed in academia, you have to hustle so hard like a business person that honestly, the hustle of figuring out how to hack it online, I honestly don't think it's any harder or more demanding. I think, again, it's personality based. So, for me, I mean, I'm working extremely hard to build my income and build my projects on the internet full time. I'm probably working hard. I'm working as hard as I was. Okay, no, probably not. I'm also kind of enjoying life because, it was, no one wants to be locked into, too much overwork. And that was one of the lessons I learned from academia. But I'm working extremely hard and probably damn close to the hardest that I worked in academia. I'm definitely working harder than my average in academia, I would say. Because I have to hustle and I feel some pressure but in a good way. It's fun. And I mean, as Jeffrey was describing it, to succeed in academia, you essentially have to be a business person. You have to create a small firm inside of the institutions. You have to raise funds and you have to run around like a chicken with your head cut off, doing different types of paperwork, teaching multiple projects, reviewing papers, all these different tasks. You're constantly task switching while essentially trying to run a mini business inside of a bureaucracy and raising money for it and all this kind of institutional politics. Hustling on the internet is not that much harder.
And here's a crucial difference that I think is very important for young people to think about. One of the key parts of hustle in an academic career is literally moving geographically, right? So I went undergrad in New York, grad school in California, had to move to England for my postdocs, lived in England, took a job in Munich, back to England for a while, then to Albuquerque. And the amount of travel you have to do to go to conferences, I've counted up, okay, I think I've been to 150 or 200 conferences in my life, and each one of them is at least, 4 plane flights typically, and staying in hotels, and you just have to be on the road an unbelievable amount. It's not just like, yay, I have my PhD, now I'll just hole up in some campus somewhere. There's a huge amount of hustle, and here's the crucial thing. If you actually want a relationship and a family and kids, 2 issues with that. 2-body problem. How are you going to get a job in the same city as your partner? And that is virtually impossible for academics. So I advise my grad students, if you're serious about academia, try to find a partner who is highly mobile, like a nurse, a school teacher, an engineer, a system administrator, one of those jobs where every city in America needs them. Don't date another academic. And then the cost of living issue. A lot of good universities are in places where houses cost absurd amounts. I saw a job ad for UC Santa Barbara, for example, assistant professor, $60,000 a year. Guess what the median house cost in Santa Barbara is? 1.3 million. If you get that job, you will never, ever be able to afford a house in that university town. Whereas if you're doing social media, you could do it from some exurban tract house in Iowa that costs $40,000,
or like South America or wherever,
South, right, or Costa Rica or Hyderabad or wherever, and you have got that flexibility.
Or Albuquerque.
Or Albuquerque. And that, I think, might actually be a crucial factor for anybody who takes their romance and their sexual relationships and their kids seriously.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was for me. Like, I had a decently paying job, but also, frankly, I mean, academia in the UK actually doesn't pay as well. I mean, I was in my 6th year. I was only making about 2,200 British pounds a month. So, I mean, not big bucks. We were fine and comfortable, more than many people have. I'm grateful for that, but not big bucks. And Britain is expensive to live in. So it's like, you know, when you actually factor it all out and you look at my finances between then and now, because I had the freedom by taking this gamble, I had the freedom to move somewhere really cheap like Albuquerque and totally change my lifestyle around living more frugally. Since I had the freedom to do that, pound for pound, remember I said before, I've already replaced I think more than 50% of that now. When you factor in the cost of living and the other lifestyle improvements, pound for pound, it actually gets even closer to being almost at a similar level.
Yeah. Let's take a couple more. Greg Wolf is asking thoughts on getting a master's degree and then applying to a PhD program versus going straight for a PhD. Well, okay, one thing to realize about this is master's programs are cash cows. I typically are paying quite a bit for a master's program in America or Britain, and it is seen by university administrators as a way to suck money out of students very efficiently.
We talked about this on one of our last streams, I think.
And so you can spend a year or two doing that, but honestly, in a lot of professions, a master's won't help you very much. And here's the crucial thing. If I'm selecting PhD students, I really, really don't give a shit whether they have a master's degree already. What matters to me is, where did they do their undergrad? What was their GPA? What are their GRE scores, standardized test scores? What's their research experience? What do the letters of recommendation say? And how well written is the research plan? Those are the things that matter. And then I'll do a Skype video interview with potential students, and I'll judge them pretty hard on their interests and verbal fluency and whether they have a realistic understanding of PhDs. It doesn't really buy them anything to have a master's degree already, particularly in psychology, where I think a lot of what they were exposed to in a master's program was probably miseducation. It might actually be a net negative if they're going into evolutionary psychology.
Right. Also, pro tip, which somehow a lot of people don't even know, you can apply to a PhD program without a master's degree. A lot of people don't know that. They think they have to get a master's degree first. It's not true. Just apply to the PhD program. If you get into the PhD program, you just do the master's along the way, is typically how it works. And master's degrees are almost never funded. PhDs, at least in the US, still mostly are. So yeah, if you're on the fence, definitely just apply for PhD programs. There's no reason not to, because you could get this is something else that people don't know is if you get into a PhD program and you get a stipend and you get that tuition waiver that you usually get if you get into a PhD program, you can just do the master's and leave. There's nothing stopping you. They're not going to make you pay for it after or take your degree away from you or anything. Absolutely. So even if you just want a master's, apply to PhD programs. You're welcome. I just saved you $30,000. All right, give it back to Jeffrey in the form of super chats.
Donate at least 1% to. I'm going to revive a Patreon, I think, at some point. Okay, nice. Let's do maybe one more.
Okay.
Ben, maybe scroll up a little bit, and let me know if anything caught your eye. No, if I ever start selling hyper male nutritional supplements that boost your testosterone, please just come here and strangle me.
Oh, there's a question for me. What do you plan to do to make it financially as a full-time social media persona? I wouldn't call myself a social media persona. Thank you very much. I am continuing my track as a serious researcher, essentially. I'm basically doing everything that I was doing as an academic. I'm just trying to create the disintermediated digital equivalent of all of those functions, essentially. So that's basically what I'm doing. I plan on writing books and selling them. I plan on growing out my patronage base by building a community and making that community increasingly interesting and awesome and edifying place to be for other interesting people who want to think about the things I'm thinking about and work on the things I'm working on. That's a major project. Building that community and sustaining it is a lot of work, and it's something I take a lot of joy in, and it's something that people. It's part of the reason why people want to pay me to be a part of the systems that I'm building and the culture that I'm building around myself. Growing out paid seminars like the one I'm doing. I'll eventually get into making online courses. I have all these course materials. I mean, I've taught many courses. I have all of the information and lecture notes sitting on my hard drive, and people, they were quite popular among students. So I plan on converting all of that to publicly available courses and podcasts for modest fees. Basically, I just plan on continuing all of my research and all of my academic functions and just carving them out in a way that makes sense for the internet and making them interesting and attractive and valuable to normal people. And I'll do that full time for like a year or so and see how the finances look then.
And we'll certainly do some follow-up videos on my channel or Justin's channel about this monetization issue, because there's a lot to say about that. We're both learning very quickly about it. The whole landscape is changing also very quickly in terms of social media platforms, censorship, revenue streams, etc. One thing I would say is that there's a stereotype that, all the serious researchers are in academia and all the flakes are outside academia. And like to some degree, that had some merit. But some of the best thinkers I know don't do their work through academia. Like Scott Alexander with his Slate Star Codex blog has huge respect and status and influence just through a blog because his content is so awesome and well researched. And also you can do things outside academia that you really can't do inside it. For example, if you want to study human behavior, you've got all these IRBs, these human subjects committees that say, you're not allowed to study this unless we give you permission to run this survey, and we are going to go over it and nitpick all the stuff that could be offensive or traumatic or whatever. And there's so many papers I've published that took literally 6 to 12 months longer than they needed to because of having to get university human subjects approval. By contrast, I can go on Twitter and tweet some random question and get 1,000 responses within 6 hours and learn something about people. It's not a representative sample, but it's probably about as representative as the students who sign up for research credit hours at a university. And so you have this situation where outside academia, fewer ideological constraints on what you can research and what you can write about. You don't have this human subjects problem. You're not warped in your approach by the demands of the federal government in terms of their funding priorities, which has a huge impact on how most academics think about their research. And you're also just incentivized to think about finding results that people might actually pay for that are relevant. So the final point is, in my field of human sexuality, there's so many things that we would love to know about human sex and relationships and intimacy that cannot be studied in universities, but that I think a lot of dating people and married couples would be happy to pay for. And that's a niche that is almost completely unexplored. So thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you found this useful.
Tell them about your book before they leave.
Yeah, so in about a week or week and a half, I've got this new ebook called Virtue Signaling, subtitled Darwinian Politics, Language Games, and Free Speech. It'll be about 100 pages of content. It's currently on pre-order, available through Gumroad.
There's a link in the description below.
For about $5. The price will go up to about $7.50 once release date hits. And I think you guys will find it interesting. So if you ever use the term virtue signaling, or you've heard it and you find it kind of interesting, I hope this book will give a little bit more of a balanced and insightful perspective on what are people actually doing when they're kind of showing off their morals publicly or politically.
Thanks for hanging out, folks.
Yeah,
it's been fun.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Sorry about the problems with the stream before. I hope you all found your way back to this part 2.
And we're done. We're just looking for the off button.
It's all good. Once we say goodbye, they all start to leave anyway. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, you're allowed. You're class dismissed. You're allowed to go.
I'm really not finding it.
It's okay. We'll keep smiling until.
Do you want to have a look?
Yeah, dude.
Yeah, actually, we'll just. Bye, everybody.
Bye.